In the port city of Charleston during the brutal year of 1778, while the colonies burned with revolution and fevered prayers for independence, a smaller and quieter fire was burning inside the whitewashed walls of a colonial orphan house. A mystery that would never be fully recorded in the annals of American history. Not because it lacked horror, but because those in power ensured that no quill, no testimony, no autopsy would survive to contradict their carefully sculpted narrative. This is the story of two identical boys whose lives were dictated not by the laws of nature, but by something far more calculated: the flawed logic of 18th century medicine, the ambitions of learned men, and the unseen machinery of an institution determined to protect itself. Established in 1751, the Charleston Orphan House was the first public orphanage in the American colonies. With its symmetrical brick facade, open courtyards, and Protestant ideals, it stood as a proud civic achievement. Its mission was printed clearly in town records: to shelter and civilize children without lineage, to reform the idle, and to raise the orphaned in accordance with godly principles and scientific reason. To the people of Charleston, it was proof that their city had matured into a beacon of Enlightenment virtue. Inside its gates, however, virtue often gave way to hierarchy, silence, and experiment. And in 1778, when the Harrow twins were delivered through its gates, something began that even the science of the time could not explain, though many tried. What follows is the account they buried. The institution's reputation. The Charleston Orphan House was constructed on land granted by the City Council, financed by merchant wealth and the tithes of slave-owning congregants. On official tours, visitors were shown the girls' sewing room, the chapel painted in modest whites, and the boys' classroom where Latin conjugations echoed off brick. But what was often omitted from tour paths were the lower halls, where newer children were quarantined, or the medical wing, an area converted from old slave quarters into treatment cells following a fever outbreak in 1766. The orphanage's board of guardians was composed of doctors, ministers, and merchants. Their interest in the facility extended beyond charity. With Charleston's intellectual elite focused on Enlightenment principles, the orphanage became a proving ground for new ideas about discipline, pedagogy, and medicine. Many children who entered its gates unknowingly became subjects, some of instruction, others of experimentation. Their guardians spoke with benevolence but ruled with severity. Children were ranked according to obedience, cleanliness, and intelligence. The least compliant were corrected. Some returned, some did not. Dr. Josiah Finley, head physician, was a respected figure in Charleston society. A Scotsman trained in Edinburgh, he brought European theories of humoral imbalance and cranial measurement to the institution. He published papers in local almanacs on the relationship between skull shape and moral temperament. The orphan house gave him unfettered access to a rotating group of young bodies, many with no living relatives, few with legal protections. Those who questioned his methods were reminded of the chaos outside the gates: war, poverty, disease. Inside, at least, there was order. That year, Charleston was under threat. British forces approached from the sea. The city's governors focused on fortifications and provisions. As resources were diverted to the war effort, the orphan house became more insular. It functioned with almost total autonomy, overseen by a reduced board and enforced by a staff that grew increasingly strict as rations shrank. Children who once received bread and fish now ate thin gruel. Medical treatments became harsher. Cold baths, purgatives, blistering. Any sign of disobedience was considered a symptom to be treated. Into this world arrived the Harrow twins. They were delivered under unusual circumstances. On the morning of July 3rd, a farmer named Elias Crowley brought them in a covered wagon, their faces wrapped in linen, their clothes soaked from the Wando River. According to the record kept in the Register of Admissions, the twins were found near the banks, clinging to the corpse of a woman presumed to be their mother. She had no identification. The boys had no names. They were registered as Elias and Elijah, named by the matron who first bathed them. Both were pale, thin, and mute. Not deaf, not cognitively impaired, just silent. At first it was believed to be trauma. But when days turned into weeks and the boys still refused to speak, the staff grew suspicious. Communication between them was done through gestures and subtle nods, always synchronized. Their movements were nearly mirrored. When one scratched his arm, the other rubbed the same spot. When one fell ill with fever, the other did too. Dr. Finley took immediate interest. In his private notebooks, hidden from official records, he referred to them not as Elias and Elijah, but as subjects A and B. He noted their telepathic appearance of connection, though quickly crossed out the word telepathic and replaced it with mirrored affliction. He requested they be moved from the lower halls to the medical wing. The matron objected, citing that the twins had shown no violent tendencies and were already adjusting to communal chores. But Finley overruled her. Inside the medical wing, the boys were placed in adjoining cells. They were given matching diets, routines, and treatments. Finley wanted to isolate variables. What he found over the next month disturbed even his clinical sensibilities. When Elias was given bark extract to induce vomiting, Elijah vomited too, despite receiving no treatment. When Elijah was forced into a cold bath, Elias developed hives. When one was pinched, the other flinched, their charts filled with contradictions and impossibilities. A visiting German doctor suggested they might be somatically bound twins, a term he admitted was not medical, but theological in nature. Finley dismissed the idea. The board, meanwhile, was intrigued. If the twins were truly connected in such a way, the implications for medicine and psychology were enormous. A plan was quietly approved: continued isolation, increased experimentation, limited staff access. The matron was reassigned. The new overseer of the medical wing was Mr. Corbett, a former naval disciplinarian with no medical training, but a firm belief in corporal correction. He was instructed to record everything. The twins were removed from group meals. They were no longer allowed outdoors. The windows in their cells were boarded up. All paper and ink were removed from the room. Still, they communicated. Mr. Corbett reported hearing taps through the wall between their cells, rhythmic knocks at nightfall. When the tapping ceased, a low hum would begin, as though both boys had agreed to some internal melody, one that neither of them sang aloud, but which echoed in their throats like a vibration. Finley documented it all. In his letters to his colleagues in Philadelphia and London, he did not use the boys' names. He referred to them only as the Harrow pair, a term that would later be struck from all official correspondence. He warned that their condition could not be explained by current theories of nerves or humors, but he refused to admit error. Instead, he proposed new theories. Perhaps shared gestation had led to a blending of fluids. Perhaps one controlled the other. Perhaps there was a dominant twin and a passive one. Perhaps the bond could be severed. The attempt to test this theory began on August 29, 1778. Elias was restrained and subjected to bleeding, a common treatment of the time. Elijah, in the adjacent cell, screamed for the first time. Not a child's cry, but a full adult wail that startled staff across the wing. He was miles away from the treatment table, untouched, yet blood leaked from his nose as though tapped from a vein. That night Corbett resigned. He left no note, only a Bible on the desk and a single word scratched into the wall of his office: UNNATURAL. Finley requested replacements from the Naval Infirmary. Young men, eager for pay and blind to moral questions. The experiments continued. But the questions grew louder, and soon the first rumors began to leak beyond the walls of the orphan house. By September, Charleston's outer streets buzzed with whispered accounts of the identical boys who feel each other's pain. Most dismissed it as hysteria or children's gossip, fueled by sailors who claimed to know someone close to the place. But inside the orphan house, the administration was growing nervous. Not because they feared exposure, no, the board was well versed in burying controversy, but because the twins were beginning to defy every framework of reason they had relied upon. The final straw came during a visit from Reverend Samuel Brewster, a moralist and loyalist sympathizer sent to audit the institution for its moral compliance amid war. His visit was supposed to be routine. A check of the dormitories, a survey of the food stores, and perhaps a sermon on Christian order. What he witnessed instead became the only surviving eyewitness account of the Harrow twins not penned by staff. According to the letter, Brewster later sent his brother in London, archived privately and later uncovered in 1923, the Reverend had requested to see the medical wing to pray for any afflicted souls. There he found the cells colder than the rest of the building, the air sour with lime and smoke. He described hearing a low humming, like bees but deeper, even before the twins were visible. The nurse attending them tried to dissuade him from entering, but he insisted. He saw the boys sitting on their separate cots, their heads angled toward each other, despite the wall between them. Their eyes did not blink. Their arms bore matching welts in the same locations. Elias's lip was cracked. Elijah's bore the same mark despite no record of injury. Brewster asked their names. Neither spoke. He knelt to pray. Mid-prayer, Elias stood. Moments later, Elijah stood in tandem. Brewster claimed their movements were so synchronized, it was as if one spirit animated two vessels. When he asked Elias if he believed in the Lord's mercy, Elijah answered, "I do." It was the only sentence either had spoken since their arrival. Brewster fled. The board silenced the incident. Brewster's letter, they claimed, was exaggeration born of loyalist panic. Still, precautions increased. The twins were placed under double observation. Their cells were reinforced. Finley began working at night, no longer recording his findings in the official journal, but in a separate black notebook he carried on his person at all times. He had by then abandoned theories of biological mirroring. His focus shifted toward dominance. He believed, without evidence, that one boy was the originator and the other a reflection. If he could determine which, he believed he could isolate the mechanism. He conducted sleep deprivation on Elias. He force-fed Elijah. The boys resisted only by subtle means: silence, glances, that low hum. Then came the month of disappearance. Between October 2nd and November 7th, 5 children in the lower halls were removed from the roll books, their beds stripped, their names erased. No deaths were recorded, no adoptions filed. Staff were warned against asking questions. But the cook, a former slave named Mercy, kept on due to her age and low profile, overheard one of the guards speaking to Finley after hours. "They don't respond the way the twins do," he had said. "They're just children." That was when Mercy began keeping her own records. Hidden behind sacks of flour and dried cornmeal, she logged the days when food deliveries increased to the medical wing and noted the nights when smoke rose from the chimneys longer than usual. She wrote down the names of the children who vanished. She never confronted anyone. She had learned long ago that survival meant silence, but she watched, and she knew. It was Mercy who first noticed the change in the twins. They stopped humming. On November 12th, she brought bread to the medical wing and passed the open cell where Elijah sat. He did not move. His hands were clenched. When she whispered a greeting, he stared directly at her for the first time. Not with recognition, but with knowing. It frightened her. Finley wrote in his private notebook that same night, "Subject B no longer mirroring A. New deviation observed. Introduction of stress appears to fracture synchrony. Opportunity for isolation experiment." He ordered the twins separated permanently. Elias remained in the medical wing. Elijah was moved to the unused attic, formerly a punishment ward. There were no other children up there, only dust, old cribs, and the smell of pigeon droppings. In the days that followed, Elias began to weaken. He refused food, his limbs stiffened, he lost vision in one eye. Yet Elijah, according to the guards, thrived. He began speaking in full sentences, simple ones but clear. When asked his name, he replied, "I am Elijah, I am me." Finley declared this proof that Elijah was the dominant twin, the originator. He ordered that Elias be left unfed for 3 days. On the 4th, he would remove the wall panel between their original cells and place Elijah back to observe reintegration of faculties. It never happened. On the 3rd day, Elias disappeared. No door had been opened. No guard had entered. The cell was locked from the outside. the key held by Finley. And yet the cot was empty. The window remained boarded, the chimney too narrow for a child. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the lime. Elijah, when questioned, only smiled. "He isn't gone," he said. "He's just not here." Panic rippled through the staff. Finley attempted to downplay the event, calling it a security lapse. He claimed the boy had escaped, possibly with help, but the guards were interrogated. No confessions came. The board met in private. They voted to close the medical wing. Finley was relieved of duty. The attic was sealed. All records referring to the Harrow twins were scrubbed. Mercy's notebook was hidden in a false wall behind the kitchen hearth, where it would remain until the building was demolished a century later. Her entries end with a single line, written on December 1st, 1778. Elijah walks the halls at night, but he speaks with two voices. And the next morning he too was gone. No body, no exit, no explanation. The Charleston orphan house would survive the war. It would to operate until 1951, serving over 4,000 children across generations. The Harrow twins were never mentioned again in official histories. The staff who remained moved on, or died, or were transferred. Finley returned to Scotland, where he was discredited and never practiced again. But the story never truly vanished. Every few decades, a child at the new housing project built over the old orphanage site claimed to hear voices through the walls, always in pairs, always humming, and none of them could ever explain where the other voice was coming from. Ignored signs. When records fade, the danger is not that we forget, it is that we begin to accept the version of events crafted by those who had the most to lose. In the decades after the disappearance of the Harrow twins, the Charleston orphan house not only recovered its public standing, it expanded. The war ended, the city flourished, and the orphanage became a model for similar institutions across the southern colonies. What few remembered, or were allowed to remember, was the thin line between reform and control that had always defined its internal operations. The year 1789 brought a renewal of interest in institutional science. Revolutionary fervor had yielded to order. New boards, filled with post-war appointees, sought to modernize operations. Among them was Dr. Lemuel Tate, a Boston physician with a passion for Enlightenment reason and a private fascination with the Charleston case he had heard about while training in Philadelphia. Though no official documents remained, whispers of the Harrow twins lingered in academic circles, an anomaly that had eluded explanation, then conveniently disappeared. Tate saw it as unfinished business. He arrived under the pretext of implementing new medical protocols, vaccination efforts, updated dietary standards, improved sanitation. But privately, he came for the attic. What he found, however, was not evidence, but absence. The attic had been sealed tight for over a decade. The boards were nailed from within, requiring hours of labor to remove. Dust choked the air. Old cots, splintered cradles, a broken crucifix on the floor, no records, no artifacts. Only a crude drawing etched into the wall. Two stick figures joined at the arm, surrounded by blackened smudges that appeared to be made with soot. Tate requested access to the older logbooks, those written before the war. He was denied. The new headmistress, Margaret Lelwyn, claimed they had been destroyed during British occupation, a lie, but an institutional one, repeated often enough to be accepted as truth. Tate knew better. The orphan house had not suffered damage during the war. Its walls had remained intact. Only certain memories had been allowed to burn. He turned his attention to the children. At the time, the house held 137 orphans, boys and girls aged 3 to 15. They were divided into wards by age, behavior, and gender. Most attended classes. A few worked in the kitchens. Some, the most unruly or fragile, were sent to the basement quarters, what staff now euphemistically called the quiet dormitory. Tate began making rounds there, citing the need for medical observation. It didn't take long before he noticed something wrong. 3 children, all under 10, exhibited a peculiar trait. When questioned separately, each spoke of a mirror friend who lived in the cracks. They did not use the same words, but the same idea emerged, that someone else was with them, someone invisible to adults but felt deeply by the child. When asked to draw their friend, all three produced crude, symmetrical figures. Faces without mouths, eyes doubled. At first, Tate dismissed this as imaginative trauma. Most children in orphanages fabricated companions. But then came the incident with Mary Kessler, age 9. Mary had arrived only a month prior, orphaned by yellow fever. Quiet, reserved, prone to night terrors. One evening she was found standing at the hallway junction outside the girls' dormitory, unmoving, eyes locked on the blank wall. She was barefoot, trembling, unresponsive to staff. A matron led her back to her bed, but the next morning, a symbol had been scratched into the plaster where she had stood. A rough circle with 2 vertical lines inside. It matched a symbol drawn in one of the Harrow case sketches Tate had recovered from an underground physicians network in Philadelphia. A drawing rumored to have been copied from Finley's black notebook. Tate began documenting. His journals from that period remain some of the most perplexing artifacts of late 18th century institutional medicine. His writing grows more erratic, shifting from detached clinical notes to anxious philosophical musings. He refers repeatedly to resonance patterns among children housed near each other, claiming that shared trauma may not only shape emotional behavior, but neurological function. He proposes that, under certain conditions of stress and proximity, the human mind may echo in others. These ideas would later be adopted, though heavily sanitized, by early psychologists in the 19th century. But in 1789, they were considered dangerous speculation, especially when tied to children who began exhibiting physical symptoms. Mary Kessler developed symmetrical bruises along both arms. When asked how she'd been injured, she said only, "She touched me through the wall." Another boy, Thomas Berg, experienced bleeding from the ear after reportedly hearing his own voice arguing with him in the dark. Neither child had access to one another. Their beds were separated by entire floors. Tate pushed for an internal investigation. He was denied. He appealed to the new Board of Guardians, who considered him disruptive. When he attempted to speak with Reverend Matthias Reeve, a senior church official with ties to the orphanage, he was instructed to leave the city. He didn't. Instead, he bribed a night guard for access to the sub-basement. What he found beneath the orphanage had not been disclosed in any public plan. A series of narrow crawl spaces and coal storage areas, some lined with stone from the original 1750s foundation. There, in the furthest corner, past an unused furnace, was a brick wall marked with a single scratched phrase, "THEYNEVERLEFT." The next day, Tate suffered a fall. According to the official report, he had been inspecting a ceiling beam in the medical wing and lost his footing. He fractured his skull and died 3 days later. No investigation was launched. His journals were boxed and returned to Boston, where they remained in family possession until their eventual rediscovery in 1912. Inside Charleston, his death was taken as evidence that meddling in the past led to ruin. But the signs did not stop. The year after Tate's death, 5 more children were relocated from the quiet dormitory after repeated episodes of sleepwalking and what staff described as language mimicry. Each child began repeating exact phrases spoken by another child minutes earlier, despite being in different rooms. One girl, Clara Wendell, awoke with the name Elijah carved into her palm. No tool was found, no witnesses. Still, no reforms were made, because institutions do not see patterns as evidence, they see them as threats. Continua. In the winter of 1790, nearly 12 years after the disappearance of the Harrow twins, Margaret Lelwyn, then in her 3rd year as headmistress, ordered a full interior restructuring of the Charleston orphan house. She cited environmental health as the rationale. Wooden walls were replaced with plaster, attics cleared, basements reinforced. The crawl space Tate had discovered was filled with concrete and sealed. Her reasoning, communicated in a carefully worded letter to the board, was simple. We must erase the strange ideas that linger in architecture. Children remember what the walls remember. But memories did not depend on walls. They lived in people. in children who had no reason to lie, no benefit in fear, and in the servants and lower staff who, despite the punishments that silence promised, began to speak in whispers again. Among them was Mercy's niece, Annabel. Having inherited her aunt's role in the kitchens, she had grown up hearing the stories her elders dared not share aloud, of the twins who once disappeared without doors, of voices that travelled between rooms without breath. She believed none of it until one night in February, when she carried a bowl of broth to the infirmary and heard a child laughing on the second floor, a child who was supposed to be sedated. The laugh did not echo. It vibrated. When she entered the corridor, all was still. She turned to leave, but the door behind her slammed. No one else was in the hall, no windows open. And yet, before her on the floor, someone had drawn a figure in broth, a twin silhouette, one line split into two. She said nothing, but that night she wrote the first page in what would become the second hidden record of the Harrow case. Her notebook, kept beneath a loose board under the kitchen stove, would later be discovered during a 1938 remodeling of the old wing. Each entry was brief, discreet, and dated. Together, they formed a pattern far more damning than any physician's notes. A child woke screaming at precisely 3:13 a.m. 3 nights in a row. Another wrote letters to a sibling he never had. A girl scratched a mirror until her fingers bled, whispering, "She's not me. I'm not her." All events separated by days or weeks, but the symptoms never changed. Mirroring, doubled perception, transferred pain. Annabel's last entry came in March of 1793. She recorded the story of a boy named Samuel Dent, age 7, who claimed he had a brother who breathes when I sleep. There was no record of Samuel having a twin. He had been abandoned at age 2. But when asked to draw his brother, he sketched 2 faces, identical except for one having its eyes stitched shut. The following morning, Samuel was found unconscious beneath his cot, bruises forming in the shape of small hands along his neck. He survived, but he never spoke again. Soon after, Annabel left the orphanage. Her whereabouts after 1793 remain unknown, yet her journal would not be the last trace of those signs. In 1801, a fire broke out in the medical wing under suspicious circumstances. Though contained quickly, it revealed structural irregularities previously hidden by renovations. Behind one of the plastered walls, construction workers found a recess filled with charred drawings, childlike but not playful. Dozens of faces, all featureless except for eyes, always in pairs. And in the center, a symbol repeated so often that the plaster behind it had blackened. 2 vertical lines within a circle, identical to what Mary Kessler had drawn in 1789. The materials were discarded, their significance unrecognized. By this time, the institutional narrative had firmly shifted. The orphan house was now hailed not only as a place of shelter, but a symbol of Charleston's resilience. The city expanded its footprint, converting nearby lots into training grounds for apprenticeships and vocational programs. Press coverage praised the transformation. Visitors saw obedient children in uniform, order, hygiene, piety. No one spoke of the sounds still heard at night. Even among the newer staff, a quiet agreement took root. Children who claimed to feel phantom touches or see shadows mimicking their every movement were labeled trauma-sensitive and referred to reverend educators. But whispers among older matrons never stopped. They recalled a time when silence was not seen as defiance, but as something that spread between children like a draught. When questions were dangerous, not because they challenged authority, but because sometimes they returned answers. By 1820, the orphan house had gone through 5 directors in 10 years. None remained long, none cited specific cause, only health concerns, family obligations, or most ominously, the burden of stewardship. But always before their departure, one child would be transferred out. No explanation, no destination, no further mention. By the time state-level oversight began in the mid-1800s, few within the institution dared to revisit its earliest decades. Those who knew the details were dead or deliberately silent. What remained were fragments, a burned page in a physician's ledger, a scratch in a wooden beam, a name scrawled in chalk behind a cellar stone. Yet even then, signs surfaced. In 1844, during a celebratory public event, two girls, new arrivals, vanished from a locked dormitory. The windows were barred, the door sealed, their beds remained warm, the floor undisturbed. No traces found, no investigation launched. The story never made it to the papers. Instead, another name was added to the list of forgotten children, whose files would quietly disappear from the ledger room. Still, their faces were seen, in reflections. In overlapping dreams described by unrelated children, in that humming, always faint, always rhythmic, always synchronized, ignored, suppressed, denied, but never gone. Horror uncovered. It was not until the final years of the 19th century that Charleston's facade of institutional pride began to fracture under its own weight. The orphan house, by then one of the oldest continuously operating public welfare institutions in the South, had come under increasing scrutiny from reformers, journalists, and amateur historians. Most were concerned with sanitary conditions, corporal punishment, or outdated pedagogy. But one woman, Clara Wentz, pursued something far more specific. Wentz was not a journalist by trade, nor an academic. She was a widowed teacher from Pennsylvania, who had arrived in Charleston in 1893 to assist with a campaign for literacy among freedmen's children. What brought her to the gates of the orphan house, however, was neither poverty nor policy. It was a drawing. She had found it inside a donated book given to her by a former student who had passed through the orphan house years earlier. The book, a primer on American history, had a torn-back page covered in pencil sketches, twin figures with no mouths, an attic window, and a crude depiction of what appeared to be two boys standing face to face, their hands interlocked, bleeding from the same palm. Wentz brought the image to the city's records office. There she uncovered her first hint of something deeper, an unsorted box labeled Irregular Cases, 1778 to 1791. Most of the folders were blank, torn, or coded in obsolete notation, but one name appeared again and again, E. Harrow. Sometimes as patient, sometimes as witness, sometimes without context at all, just a name scratched into the edge of a page, as if trying to remain. Wentz began compiling. What started as personal curiosity became an informal investigation. She visited the orphanage weekly, volunteering as a reader and tutor to gain access to the grounds. She brought gifts, books, sweets, notebooks, and began asking children to draw freely. At first the pictures were ordinary, animals, trees, saints. Then came the symmetry. One child drew a pair of eyes above a dark line. Another drew a boy who had no mouth but whose brother spoke for him. A third, when asked to explain a figure hovering in the background of her scene, whispered, "That's the one who watches while I sleep." The staff dismissed these as fantasies. Wentz did not. In her private journal, later published posthumously in a limited academic run, she recorded the phrase that would become the center of her theory. The trauma did not end with them. It replicated. She began to map the orphanage's structure, cross-referencing floor plans from the 18th century with current layouts. She discovered rooms that no longer existed, corridors now sealed, entire wings that had been quietly converted or erased. One particular stairwell, marked in an 1805 blueprint, had no modern equivalent. Yet its supposed location lay beneath the West Dining Hall, where Wentz often heard what she described as a second rhythm of footsteps after the children had gone. In 1894, during a city-led pest control initiative, a wall in the basement buckled under the weight of a fumigation barrel. What was revealed behind it shocked even the workers. A narrow hallway, bricked over. The air beyond it was cold and dry, despite the humidity. The corridor led to a chamber no larger than a closet, empty except for remnants of old straw bedding, 2 iron cuffs bolted to the floor, and a single wooden board nailed to the far wall. On that board were carvings, the name Elias, the date Sept. 2, 1778, and a drawing, 2 heads, one weeping, the other smiling. Wentz managed to view the site before it was resealed. She made rubbings of the carvings, photographed the chamber with an early Kodak camera, and sent her findings to a small circle of correspondents, clergy, educators, amateur historians. None could explain the evidence, but the orphan house administration acted swiftly. 2 days after the discovery, Wentz was banned from the property. The basement was sealed again, this time with iron reinforcement. The chamber was listed in municipal logs as a structural void of no historic significance. Wentz, undeterred, continued her investigation from the outside. She spoke with former residents, now grown, who remembered strange experiences in their youth. One man described waking up with bleeding hands, as if he had clawed at something unseen. A woman recalled a recurring dream of being split in half, watching herself walk away while unable to scream. Another, a war veteran turned dock worker, refused to speak at all. He only drew, pairs of eyes, always watching. Then came the fire. In November of 1896, a blaze broke out in the western wing of the orphan house. It began in the oldest dormitory and spread rapidly. 3 children died of smoke inhalation. 7 were injured. Official cause, faulty wiring. Unofficially, whispers told of a girl who had been found in the attic, arms outstretched, repeating a name no one recognized: Elijah. The fire revealed something the restoration crews could not ignore. Behind one collapsed wall was a hidden alcove not listed on any blueprints. Inside were piles of ash, charred wood and bones, small, unmarked, human. The city declared them colonial-era remains, possibly from a burial that predated construction. But those bones were less than a century old. A quiet city burial followed. No press, no memorial, no further inquiry. Wentz's final journal entry, dated January 7, 1897, read, "I fear this place is not haunted by spirits but by errors, repeated, preserved, buried. The twin boys are gone, but their silence echoes in every stone." She died 2 months later of pneumonia. Her notes were boxed and forgotten for decades, but the horror she uncovered, unwanted, unexplained, unfinished, had already bled into the walls. And it waited. The fire of 1896 should have been a reckoning. For any institution less protected by civic pride and generational silence, it might have been. But the Charleston Orphan House had survived too much, and those who administered it knew how to mold tragedy into opportunity. Within weeks of the fire, a campaign was launched for renovations and expansion, funded by Charleston's wealthiest families. Public speeches praised the orphanage's resilience. The children once again were trotted out in pressed uniforms for photographers and patrons. But beneath the celebratory veneer, an irreversible fracture had formed. Staff turnover surged. Teachers resigned without notice. One night matron, a woman named Beatrice Elwood, fled mid-shift and was never seen in Charleston again. Her last words, reportedly whispered to a kitchen assistant, were, "They're starting to act like them." The children, especially those in the surviving dormitory, had changed, not in behavior, but in manner. They answered questions in unison, though seated apart. They stopped using their given names. When spoken to individually, they would glance sideways, as if checking with someone unseen before replying. One boy began sleeping beneath his bed. Another refused to speak unless another child was within sight. Even the youngest began humming at odd hours, a tune none could identify, but all seemed to know. The board dismissed concerns as post-traumatic reaction to the fire. They did not speak of what Reverend Boyle, the institution's spiritual counselor, had written privately to a colleague in Savannah. He described visiting the injured children 2 days after the fire. All had been placed in the infirmary. One, a girl named Hester, had burns on her arms and a severe concussion. When Boyle approached to pray, Hester reached for him, not with her hands, but by raising one burnt arm and pointing to a corner of the room. "There," she said. "He said you're next." Boyle claimed he turned and saw nothing, but in the moment before he blinked, he felt heat against his back and the sense of someone watching him, not with malice but with familiarity, as though it knew him, as though it had seen him in another life. He left the orphan house that night and never returned. In the absence of long-term staff, The institution relied more heavily on transient workers, untrained aides and volunteers from surrounding churches. Oversight dwindled, but children continued to arrive, orphans from typhoid outbreaks, yellow fever, and the poverty that followed Reconstruction. Among them was a pair of siblings, fraternal twins, a boy and a girl. James and Lillian Cortland. They arrived in 1898, age 6, after the death of their mother in a textile fire in Augusta. Their father had died in a work accident 2 years prior. With no surviving kin, the Cortlands were placed in the Charleston orphan house as wards of the city. Staff noted their quiet demeanor. Lillian rarely spoke. James did the talking for both. But what disturbed the matrons most was their lack of emotional variance. No crying, no playfulness, no curiosity. They complied with every instruction, ate every meal, slept through every night, until the bruises began. First Lillian, then James. Always identical. Small circular marks on the arms, then the backs of their knees, then their necks. Medical staff assumed scabies, but no mites were found. Tests for anemia returned normal. The bruises would appear overnight and vanish within a day. One morning, both children were found in the dining hall before breakfast, sitting at opposite tables but facing each other, completely still. Their mouths were open but made no sound. When approached, Lillian suddenly slammed her head against the table, twice. James, across the room, fell to the floor in a seizure. The incident was written up as a traumatic episode. The children were moved to separate wards. 3 days later, both were missing. Again, there were no signs of forced exit, no broken windows. Doors remained locked. The building was searched for hours. A basement trapdoor was pried open, only to reveal a sealed space filled with decades of soot and crumbled wood. In the ashes, a figure had been traced, 2 children holding hands, their shadows taller than their bodies. Ollis investigated, then quietly withdrew. The official story became that the twins had fled into the city, despite neither child knowing the streets nor being seen again. The Charleston orphan house ceased admitting twins in 1899. Publicly, this was never acknowledged, but internal correspondences among the board, now accessible through private collections, confirm the directive. Twinned applicants to be redirected. 1 is enough. By the turn of the century, the institution's age was beginning to show. Its architecture, once lauded, was now described as antiquated. Its reputation for moral instruction could no longer shield it from scrutiny by emerging social reformers. Investigative committees began to question why certain files were missing, why some children's admissions bore no exit records, why the ledger from 1778 through 1795 had entire pages sliced clean out. In 1901, the city announced a partial audit. It was never completed. The lead auditor, Nathaniel Ross, withdrew mid-process citing personal health. His assistant resigned weeks later. No findings were published. The files returned to storage. But Ross did leave behind a single margin note, scribbled on the back of a map of the orphanage. They keep appearing in pairs. By the 1930s, public orphan care was declining across the country. Modern child welfare agencies, foster systems, and state-run homes were replacing outdated institutions. Charleston followed suit. In 1951, the orphan house was closed permanently. During the decommissioning process, construction crews were tasked with gutting the oldest wings. Floorboards lifted, walls came down. Beneath the wooden planks of what had once been the boys' study hall, they found more carvings, hundreds of them, names, drawings, symbols, some in English, some unintelligible, all arranged in pairs. And on the central beam, preserved in perfect shape despite the years, "He breathes when I sleep. We are never alone." The wood was removed, burned, the site was paved over. Today, few in Charleston speak of the Harrow twins. Their names do not appear in tour guides or historic plaques. Most historians dismiss the story as urban folklore, convenient myth spun from incomplete records. But the drawings remain in archives. So do the journals of Clara Wentz. So do the final entries of children whose stories were never meant to endure. And sometimes, late at night, on streets that trace the old foundations of the orphan house, People say you can still hear it. That humming. 2 tones, perfectly synchronized. And no one knows where the second voice is coming from. Legacy and silence. When the Charleston orphan house was demolished in 1951, bulldozers did more than level a building. They buried generations of institutional memory. Beneath the rubble disappeared the footprint of the oldest public orphanage in the United States, and with it, hundreds of unmarked lives. City officials marked the occasion with a short column in the Post and Courier, describing the event as the end of an era and a necessary step toward modernization. There was no memorial, no mention of the children who had vanished, no acknowledgement of what had been whispered about the twins. In the years that followed, the land remained largely vacant. A community center was proposed, but never built. For decades, it was used intermittently for overflow parking during parades and carnivals, but the space never held. Local children would not play there. Families reported dogs refusing to cross its cracked foundation. An urban legend took root that the ground had never fully settled. Then, in 1973, a property developer acquired the lot for a low-income housing project. The city approved the plan quickly. No one questioned the cost. No one asked why the price had been lowered twice before the sale. Construction began that summer. Within weeks, workers complained of injuries, slips on dry floors, tools misplaced. A welder reported hearing his own name shouted from behind a sealed wall. Another claimed to see 2 boys standing at the edge of the lot, never moving, always watching. The foreman dismissed the stories. The project continued, until they reached the foundation. Beneath layers of dirt and stone, a vault was discovered. Not a formal crypt, but a brick chamber sealed on all sides. No doors. Inside, archaeologists found fragments of clothing, wooden boards with names carved into them, and bones. Small, juvenile, scorched. Local authorities attributed the find to historic waste disposal. The remains were catalogued but not identified. No effort was made to trace records. The vault was resealed. The building went up. They called it Harrow Place. The name, according to marketing brochures, was chosen for its evocative colonial feel. Residents moved in quickly. The waiting list was long, but within a year, turnover increased sharply. Families left without notice. Complaints were vague. Sounds in the walls. Cold spots in summer. Children having bad dreams. Then came the drawings. Apartment 3B reported that their 6-year-old son had begun sketching strange figures on the walls, always in pairs, always with hollow eyes. In 4D, twin girls stopped using their own names and began calling each other Eli and Elle. One mother found her toddler murmuring to the mirror, repeating a phrase she swore she'd never taught him. "He's behind me again." Management dismissed it as mass suggestion. Tenants were offered counseling. But the pattern deepened. On September 11, 1975, a maintenance worker was found unconscious in the basement. When he awoke, he could not speak. Hospital scans showed no trauma. When given a pen and paper, he wrote one line: "Tell them to stop humming." That same day, across the hall, a woman named Lydia Marsh was preparing dinner when she heard her daughter laugh, a loud rhythmic giggle from the bathroom. But when Lydia entered, her daughter was standing silent, eyes closed. On the mirror, traced in steam, were the words, "He speaks when I don't." Lydia moved out the next morning. The housing board brought in consultants, noise inspectors, child psychologists, even a folklore researcher from the local university. But no official findings were released. A maintenance log from the period, later obtained through a Freedom of Information request, contained an entry that simply read, 3F reporting humming again. Checked walls, nothing found. Next week, same complaint. Child now mute. By the late 1980s, half the units were empty. Vandalism increased. Graffiti appeared on the exterior walls. Some tags referenced Elijah. Others were more cryptic, symbols of 2 vertical lines in a circle, drawn with precision far beyond the style of street artists. A neighborhood campaign to reclaim the building failed. Funding collapsed. The city condemned Harrow Place in 1991. But before it was demolished, a group of local historians received permission to enter and document the interior. Among them was Martha Raines, a teacher and amateur archivist who had long studied Charleston's institutional history. What she found in apartment 1A would lead to a decades-long personal investigation. Behind the wall paneling in the back bedroom were hidden pages, dozens of them written in a child's hand. Each page bore mirrored text, often backwards, as if meant to be read in reflection. Some were simple, "I am him." Others were fragments, "If he feels it, I feel it. Eli wants to stay, they locked us out, but we still sing." The handwriting varied slightly across pages, suggesting more than one author, but all seemed to share the same cadence, the same voice. Raines collected the pages and began a private archive. Over the next 10 years, she uncovered more. Interviews with former staff, long-forgotten journal entries, and a trove of materials found in a storage facility once leased by Clara Wenz's surviving relatives. The documents included photos of the original orphan house blueprints, notes from Wenz's visits, and sketches made by children she'd interviewed, nearly all of them featuring dual figures, mirrored rooms, or open mouths beside closed ones. Her conclusion, recorded in a 2002 academic paper: this was not folklore, it was engineered silence. She proposed that what we call hauntings are often the lingering echoes of suppressed memory, not ghosts, but unacknowledged trauma etched into the design of our institutions. She called it architectural inheritance. Most dismissed her. But in 2011, a film crew scouting locations for a documentary on Charleston's forgotten landmarks requested access to the site of the old orphan house. Raines joined them. They brought recording equipment, high-frequency audio tools, and digital scanners. The first night they camped inside what had been the infirmary. The next morning, one microphone was found destroyed, though no one heard movement. The only recording retrieved contained a low, repetitive tone, like a drone, interrupted occasionally by what some said sounded like breath. They did not return for a second night. The footage was never aired. But Raines kept the audio, and in the last interview before her death she played it for a local reporter. 2 tones, always synchronized, always returning to the same rhythm. And behind it, faint but clear, the sound of a child's voice. "He's still here, he never left, he's just not me." By the early 2020s, the original site of the Charleston orphan house had become a fenced-in void. The land, nominally city property, had been subdivided into vague parcels for decades but never developed. Weeds covered the cracked pavement. A rusted historical marker stood near the northeast corner, its text faded and incomplete. Local children passed it on their way to school without knowing what it once held. Most believed the stories were just that, stories, until the rediscovery of the Mercy and Annabelle journals. In 2023, during the digital archiving of private collections held by the Charleston Women's Historical Society, volunteers found a locked drawer in a filing cabinet marked "Kitchen Receipts, 1780s. Inside were 2 cloth-bound notebooks. One, faded and brittle, bore the initials MW. The other, sturdier and more legible, was labeled AM with the date 1791 stitched into its cover. What they contained changed the historical narrative of the orphan house permanently. The Mercy Journal, written in a trembling but deliberate hand, chronicled the earliest years of the Harrow twins' time in the institution. It corroborated previously unverifiable claims, the mirrored afflictions, the humming, the wall knocks. More disturbingly, it documented missing children with precise dates and physical descriptions, none of whom appeared in surviving official records. The entries ended abruptly after describing the night Elijah allegedly spoke in 2 voices. The Annabelle Journal continued from there. Her writing was sharper, more observant, more fearful. She recorded cold drafts in sealed rooms, children repeating phrases in their sleep, and most significantly, direct encounters with drawings and messages hidden throughout the building. One passage described peeling back wallpaper to reveal a series of carved names: Eli, Elijah, Elias, LLLL. She circled the page and wrote beneath it, "He keeps trying to come back, but I think there's more than one of him now." The academic community, previously reluctant to give weight to such stories, responded with unprecedented seriousness. The journals were authenticated, preserved, and made publicly accessible. Suddenly, journalists, podcasters, and historians descended on Charleston with fresh eyes. A wave of articles, mini-documentaries, and social media threads revived public fascination with the Harrow twins. But fascination did not mean understanding. In 2024, a group of graduate students from the University of South Carolina proposed an immersive research installation on the site. The project was intended as a historical reconstruction, interactive, respectful, educational. The city approved. They called it the Mirror Room. Built in a temporary structure, modeled after archival blueprints of the orphanage's medical wing, the installation recreated the twin cells of Elias and Elijah, using soundscapes, lighting, and verbatim excerpts from journals and staff records. Visitors could walk between the cells while audio played reconstructed humming, children's whispers, and quotes from Mercy, Finley, and Wens. On opening day, visitors reported unease. One woman fainted. A child became disoriented, claiming to see another me behind the wall. Audio equipment failed intermittently, monitors flickered, and in a corner of the installation, where no writing had been programmed, the name Elias appeared scratched faintly into the plexiglass. The project was shuttered within 2 weeks. A final report by the graduate team was never published. But a private note from their lead researcher circulated later through online forums. It read simply, "They weren't warning us. They were showing us what happens when you build systems that feed on silence." That silence, engineered, maintained, enforced, had never fully lifted. In Charleston, many still refuse to discuss the orphan house. Former residents, now elderly, remember the place with a mixture of reverence and dread. Some recall discipline and prayers. Others remember voices coming from beneath the floorboards. Few are willing to talk on record. But the ground remembers. In 2025, construction resumed on the site, this time for a boutique hotel. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were conducted before foundation work began. The scans revealed irregularities, subterranean voids that did not align with modern infrastructure. One technician noted that the shapes were too symmetrical to be natural. Another pointed out what looked like a corridor ending in a perfect circle. The construction firm dismissed the data. Concrete was poured. On June 18, 2025, a sinkhole opened beneath the northwest corner of the site. No injuries, no casualties, but inside the hole, just 5 feet below the surface, photographers captured an image, a beam, charred, cracked. And carved into its surface, preserved in soot, the familiar symbol, a circle, 2 lines, perfectly vertical. When news reached Clara Wentz's surviving relatives, they donated the rest of her documents to the city archive. Among the pages was one she had marked, "For the future." It contained a short paragraph. "One day someone will listen, not because they believe in ghosts, but because they recognize the shape of what was done here." The twins were only the beginning. The real story is how we let the pattern repeat, over and over, mirrored, mirrored, mirrored. Today that paragraph sits behind glass in a Charleston museum. Most pass it without reading, but some stop, and a few, late at night, say they still hear it, that sound, that low harmonic tone. 2 notes, in unison. And no one ever knows where the second voice is coming from. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.